Hey, welcome to the GRadulting Workshop Series. My name is Debbie McCutsky, and I am the coordinator of services and programs for graduate student legal aid. I use she, her pronouns. On behalf of the Grad Legal Aid team, we're happy to see you here on Zoom, and we know that some of you are watching this on YouTube, so good to see you. Today's workshop is how do I avoid accidental plagiarism? It happens, which is why we're having this workshop today. So before we get started, I want you to know that Legal Aid is here to help you. We have an array of services that you have already paid for them because you paid your graduate student fee. So let me tell you what we've got. We have an attorney on staff. His name is Zach Mundy, and he provides help to students who have general legal problems. We have an immigration attorney on staff. She meets with students, or sorry, she's not on staff. She's from the community, and we've hired her to meet with students once a month. We do advocacy for students who are charged by the university. I am a notary, so I can help you with that. So if you want to learn more about who we are and what we do, just take a look at our website, gradlegalaid.umd.edu. So now for a bit of housekeeping, automatic closed captioning has been enabled. Near the end of this workshop, we'll post a link to a survey. Please take a minute to reply. We want to know, are we doing a good job? We will email links to the survey, the recording, and the slides to everyone who registered this afternoon or possibly tomorrow morning. The links will also be posted on our website. So we welcome your questions, your comments. You can post them in the chat. You can raise your hand. If we end up having a conversation, that's great. Makes for a little richer time together. So I am pleased to introduce our speaker who is back with us for, I don't know, maybe it's the 10th time. We are so happy to see you, Dr. Linda McCree. Linda's with the University of Maryland Graduate School. She is a director for professional and academic development. She's also the director of the Graduate Writing Center. So welcome, Linda.
Thank you.
I also want to take a minute to introduce Simone Durham. Simone is a doctoral candidate and graduate student advocate for Grad Legal Aid. And Simone, before we dive into accidental plagiarism, you know about plagiarism because you are a student advocate and you help students who've been charged by the university, and you understand the potential consequences of plagiarism. So can you talk a little bit about that before we let Linda take over?
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome everybody who is here or who will be watching this on YouTube. Like Debbie said, my name is Simone. I am a grad student in the sociology department. This is my kind of second round working for Grad Legal Aid. And consequently, I've also worked for the Grad Writing Center. But as a grad student advocate, essentially what I do is assist students through any administrative processes that you have to go through with the university when you are referred for a violation of university policy. This is often our policy of academic integrity, but it could also be our code of conduct or the code, the residence life codes if you live in campus housing. And we also represent students if they have cases with the Title IX office or the Office of Civil Rights and Sexual Misconduct. So in those proceedings, particularly when it comes to academic integrity violations, university professors at UMD are supposed to report all violations of academic integrity directly to the Office of Student Conduct. And from there, they investigate and pursue the referral. Plagiarism is a very common referral for graduate students in particular, because we write a lot of papers, we do a lot of, like substantial reports and things of that nature, where we are using external sources. And so a lot of times what we see happening is students are not necessarily intentionally plagiarizing, or in other words, stealing other people's ideas or copy pasting from sources. What often happens is that you're not citing correctly, or you were not aware that you had to cite for a particular kind of assignment. In general, you should always cite, and that will usually help you avoid a lot of issues. But the standard sanctions for a violation of academic integrity of any type, including plagiarism, are suspension and an XF, which is a notation on your transcript that you failed due to a violation of academic integrity. Depending on the assignment and the process and exactly what happened, you may get lesser sanctions than that, or you may get harsher sanctions than that. But it's my job to help you navigate that process all the way from the referral through the completion of your resolution agreement and the sanctions that you were given. So that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Simone. So we're trying to keep y'all out of trouble. So please pay attention to Linda's presentation. She's got some great tips and some very practical things to share with us to help you through this semester. Take it away, Linda.
Thank you, Debbie, and thanks, Simone, for that background. I think that knowing what's going to happen, but I think also knowing that it's often something pretty accidental, or not, certainly not intended, but in unintentional plagiarism still often means a trip to the academic council, and as Simone said, faculty are obligated to report it. That's part of the Code of Academic Integrity at Maryland. And that's actually where I'm going to start, is just a little bit about that Code of Academic Integrity. So, right, so we have a Code of Academic Integrity at Maryland. Lots of universities do, but ours is specific to us, but also a little bit distinct in some measures. And just to kind of go over what is academic integrity in general. So broadly speaking, as a graduate student, you've joined an academic community. The pursuit of knowledge is the kind of common fundamental goal. And one of the values of the community is a commitment to honesty in all academic work. And really that academic integrity is really about that shared commitment to honesty in your academic work. And so Maryland has a code of academic integrity that encompasses more than plagiarism. So here it is. The University of Maryland has a code of academic integrity that reminds all members of our community that cheating, fabrication, facilitating academic dishonesty, plagiarism, and self-plagiarism are all acts of academic dishonesty, and the code is administered by the Office of Student Conduct. So cheating, like looking at someone else's exam, fabrication, making up your results, facilitating academic dishonesty, helping someone else, or sharing your notes so someone else can, passing your test so that someone else can use the answers. I'm going to focus on plagiarism and a little bit about self-plagiarism as the elements of academic integrity, certainly that has something to do with, usually have the most to do with writing, since I'm the writing center director, and also I think are the most common reasons that graduate students find themselves in the Office of Student Conduct. So what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is presenting the words or the ideas of someone else from an article, from a website, from a classmate even, as your own work. And this often happens when you are failing to cite or to acknowledge within your text the source of information or the source of the words so the general information or the specific words in a written exercise, right? In something that you are submitting to be evaluated in writing. How do you avoid it? The short answer is Always use proper citation for any words, any ideas, any images, any data that you're using from a source in your assignments, your projects, your papers, etc. If the idea or the words didn't come from you, you need a citation. And we actually have a guide on the Graduate School Writing Center's website. That's what it says, see the back of the guide, that you can print out and keep by your computer or something, or you just hot link it and or bookmark it, and you can see it whenever you need to. But so it's easy. Avoiding plagiarism is easy. Just cite everything. But obviously, that's not the whole answer. What does it mean to cite things well? And that's really what we're going to talk about. So some mechanical things though to prevent plagiarism. I think the reasons that I most often see students have plagiarized, they come to the Writing Center often as a sanction from the Office of Student Conduct. Most often it's that they've started really late, right? They've waited till too late to start the paper, and then they feel like it's a kind of crush to get it done. They've read things and they've kind of grabbed them, literally cut and pasted them into a document, thinking, oh, I'll go back and cite it later. You forget where you grabbed it from. You're not keeping track. You're in a rush, and you think, well, I just need to submit this, right? So start early, that's one way, and make sure you're keeping track of wherever you looked at things, keep track. And there's all sorts of ways to keep track. I could talk about that some more. If you're doing papers, usually you'll use a citation manager, which the library actually does a lot of workshops about citation managers. And in fact, they're doing one this Thursday on the 6th. Another thing to do is ask your instructor what citation style you should be using and what kind of citation they're expecting for any given homework, paper, etc. I've often seen students where they don't realize that for something like a homework assignment that they think is something more informal, that the professor or the instructor really did expect things to be properly cited. So always check with the instructor. Never just cut and paste a source from your paper. That's always going to land up being a problem, right? You have to be incredibly careful for it not to be a problem. And then asking for help. And again, I cut this out of the resource that we have on the Graduate School Writing Center website, but asking for help, coming to the Writing Center and talking with someone about, like, did I do this correctly? Am I citing these things well? I think I need to paraphrase more, etc. So those are all some things that you can do to prevent plagiarism. But they sound easy, but they're not. So we'll go into some more detail about things. So really the key to avoiding plagiarism is making sure you're citing things properly. And so what does proper citation look like? Well, let's figure out what a citation is first. A citation is a signal to your reader that the information you're sharing, that you've included in your document, came from somewhere else. In academic writing, we're always building on the ideas of others, etc. So a citation is really a way to communicate to your reader, here's the origin of this idea, here's the foundation of, here's where my ideas came from, here's the idea I'm building on, etc. So it's really a way to distinguish, here's what came from my head, here's what are my ideas, here's my contribution to, here are the ideas that I'm building on, the conversation that started before me. So a citation includes two things, no matter what style you're using, and I'll say a little bit more about citation style in a second, but citations include a note in your paper, in the prose of your paper, and then a reference list at the end. Sometimes that reference list is called references, sometimes it's called bibliography, sometimes it's called works cited, but something at the end in addition to something in text. And so let's take a look at what this looks like. So here is an example of where it says in text, like this is actually something from an article. Here's the things in blue are the in-text citations, right? Multiple mothering ideologies have been identified in the literature, including intensive mothering. That idea came from Hayes in 1996. Competitive mothering from Toronto in 2001. Combative mothering, Moore and Abbott's 2016, and integrated motherhood from Dow 2016. And where would we find, so I'll just use the last one here, right? That last citation, in text, it looks like this. And then on the reference list at the end, here's the full citation, the author's name. This is in APA style, the author's name, the source, the title, the year, etc. So that's what they look like in text, and then on a reference. Every style does things a little bit differently, but you're always using some kind of in-text and some kind of reference. And so here's an example of completely different things. So the previous example was from sociology. This is from cybersecurity, so a completely different field. And here, if you look at the introduction there, you see in brackets little numbers, right? Lots of little numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the in-text citations. You can see they're very different, right? We're not getting the name and the year. These are kind of less intrusive, we might say. They're also hot linked. This is, I grabbed this from an electronic journal. So if you click on any one of those in the journal, the citation would come up. But this is what, oops, I thought I had the citation. Sorry, I thought I had those citations. But in any of these, you'd hot link on the, you'd click on the hot link, and you'd get some information about them. So it's a very different style. This is the style most typically used in engineering, but those are still citations. I'm pointing this out if it seems incredibly obvious. I worked with a student once who said, I had no idea that's what those numbers were. I thought they were numbering the sentences. I had no idea that that was a citation. So it's important to know. Why do we cite? Again, in the American education system, we have this idea that writers are expected to acknowledge, and that's with a citation, the words and the ideas of others, right? And so a citation, again, demonstrates that you've done your research, and it shows where you did that research, giving credit to your sources, and also giving credibility to your work, which is important. So I've mentioned a couple times different citation styles, and this is really not every, but disciplines use different citation styles. And it's really about kind of what information, usually the big differences are in text, so in the prose. What do you want to see differently as an engineer versus as a literature person, right? So the first one here, MLA, I'll use that as an example. That's my field, literary studies. Not surprisingly, in literary studies, when I see a citation, I want to know who said it, and I want to know what page I can find it on, because we're often quoting directly from novels, poems, etc. So I want to know who it was, but also exactly where I can find it. We saw APA a few slides ago. APA really wants to know who was the author, but also what year was it? That's really significant. How recent was this research? And then we saw IEEE, really the engineers want to know, okay, it's there somewhere. I don't need to be interrupted in the text to know it, because we're often building on a lot of ideas at once. So those are there's reasons why different disciplines use different styles. But all of them include, no matter what, all of them include, so first of all, you need a citation every time you're referring to the ideas of others in your text. That might be when you include a very specific idea you learned from a source, when you're summarizing something you've read, when you're directly quoting from a source. And again, remember, both in the text and a reference at the end. So lots of times students just think, well, if I just change the words around, isn't that okay? Isn't that how I avoid plagiarism? And really it's not, for a couple reasons. So first of all, even if you're changing the words effectively, even if it's a really good paraphrase, right? And you're representing the words, representing the ideas, but in your own words, the ideas have come from somewhere else, and you still need to be citing the ideas. But often just changing a couple of words isn't enough, right? You're still really taking the ideas without much change, without really kind of incorporating it into your own way of thinking, etc. So it's okay in most disciplines to use a direct quotation. In some disciplines, it's pretty rare. So that's an important thing to know about your discipline. But it's probably better to use a direct quotation and capture the words entirely than to just move around one or two words and think, okay, well, now it kind of sounds like it's my own. And again, we'll look at a few examples. So we maybe should have started with, why do we care so much about plagiarism? And for any of you that are not, they're international students, it may seem that Americans care about plagiarism more than was the case at your undergraduate institution or your previous institution for a master's degree, etc. And in a lot of ways, plagiarism really is a distinctly American concern. And this may be something that is familiar to folks. This story, maybe it's getting a little old. There was a story many years ago when Melania Trump gave a speech at the Republican National Congress, Republican National Convention, before her husband was nominated to be president officially, nominated to be the candidate officially. She gave a speech, and very quickly people realized it was word for word, parts of it were a speech from Michelle Obama. And so this article on Vox is using that example to kind of capture people's attention. But they're also explaining why plagiarism is a really modern idea and also a really American idea. So for one thing they say is plagiarism as a concept didn't exist in ancient cultures, right? Where especially if we think about texts in the Western world, that's the one I'm most familiar with, right? Homer just repeated things from the Iliad, the Odyssey repeated things from the Iliad, and one story repeated another story. We had an oral tradition, we weren't writing things down. So repetition and copying were incredibly common, but also kind of societies in which knowledge comes from a divine revelation, right? Didn't value individual ownership, right? As we do now in really modern Western civilization. So that's one thing, a really kind of shift in thinking, the idea that we can own ideas. And that really is what plagiarism represents, the idea that we can own ideas so you can steal ideas. And, you know, even in the US, we think of this concept of intellectual property, and it really doesn't, we aren't too concerned about it until about the middle of the 19th century. And here's a court case that we see the phrase intellectual property come up for one of the first times. Probably you can look at texts by all sorts of early American authors. Politicians, we'll use politicians as an example again, and they would have been using references to all sorts of texts. But we really start to thinking about, well, we can own ideas the same way that we can own other things. And this is this quote here, right? Only in this way can we protect intellectual property, the labors of your mind, productions and interests, as much as we can the wheat that you cultivate, right? So we started in the mid 19th century to really think about, well, we can own ideas. You can own ideas the same way you can own your labor, the same way that you can own something you've grown, something physical that you own. Sorry, I can't see part of my own slide. So that's the background, but also good citation is more than just not plagiarizing something, right? So really what we want to be thinking about is acknowledging that words and ideas that we use in our writing came from someplace. So it's not just about, oh, I'm not stealing something, but really saying, like, look, here's where my ideas came from. I'm showing my readers, anybody who's reading my work, like what that trail of ideas is. It's also establishing credibility as a scholar for yourself. So again, that kind of, here's where my ideas came from. Here are the things that I'm building on. Here it's the conversation I've joined. And your good citation demonstrates that. And the other thing it does is provide for anyone reading your work a way to find out, a way to back to your sources so that they can look at them too, and maybe even join the conversation that you were in. Kind of, they can also understand some of what you've read. So let's dig into how to cite, and since that's really the way that you're going to avoid plagiarism. So we've already said you need a citation both in the text and in the references. So again, why are you doing it? You're really communicating that you've been in conversation with a source, right? That your ideas have been bounced off of this source, that you're integrating your ideas, that you're responding to them, referencing them, etc. So again, your readers and expect to hear what you have to say in a paper, in a homework assignment, etc. So while your readers might recognize that, yes, you're joining an academic conversation, your reader has really come to your paper to read your perspective. And so you need to be providing your perspective, not just referencing what you've read, but really analyzing, synthesizing, commenting, discussing, really building on those sources. And that can get tricky sometimes. Right? I know it's a pretty common thing for relatively coursework early in your coursework to have your professors to assign things like read this article and write me a summary, or read this article and write me a reaction. And they've clearly said, read this article. And it's easy for us to think, oh, what they really want is for me to represent this article. But if you really think about it, you've been asked to read that article and asked to give a summary, a synthesis, etc., to really demonstrate what you know about it, how it's starting to feed into your knowledge in the discipline, etc. So chances are, even if it's not a formal paper, right, even if it's not a published article, your reader, your professor, wants to know, what do you think about this? Not just can you reference what you read, but what is your perspective? What have you analyzed? What have you synthesized? What connections are you making? So that's one thing to keep in mind, that your papers should represent your work and your ideas about something, not just a collection of someone else's ideas. So that's the why. Right. And and then a citation is an indication to your reader that your idea came from someplace, right? Your idea has a clear source, but there's also an expectation that the words that you use to represent that idea are your own, right? That you've made it your own, that you understood it, that you're able to analyze it, that you're able to build on it, etc. And that they're not the direct words of a source. So if I read your paper and I don't see a citation or I don't see direct quotation, I'm going to think, oh, all of this is your ideas. And if it's not all your ideas, then you're misrepresented what you're doing, right? You've misrepresented your own work. Or if I see citations, but not direct quotations, I think, oh, okay, well, clearly you got these ideas from someplace, but the words on the page are yours. So that's why you don't want to just use direct wording from a source. So what do you need to do? Be concise with the other source, right? Offer an honest paraphrase, clearly indicate what ideas were yours and what ideas came from the source, right? And you do that with all sorts of language, like to summarize whatever source, or in reference to that source, or that source is useful to you because, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about paraphrase in just a second. And another thing that I see students doing poorly, and it's not just a problem of academic honesty, but also just a problem of really good academic work, is don't expect the sources to do things for you. Often we see sources, and I've certainly had this happen too. You see a source like, oh, that's exactly what I want to say, so I'll just cut that and put it in here. But that's not you doing the work, right? So you haven't done the work just by cutting and pasting it. That's not much effort. And so you want to make sure that you're commenting, synthesizing, etc. The other way that this often happens is I see something, I think, oh, that represents what I want to say, so I can't possibly say it any better, right? And you just assume that you put it in your paper, and even if you're citing it correctly, you just kind of drop it in, use a quote, use a citation, but your reader doesn't really know why you have included it, right? So don't expect the sources to do all the work for you. Really be sure that when you include any kind of a source, it's really clear to your reader what that source adds to your ideas. Why have you included it? Why are you building on it? All right, and then some ways to think about using sources. We talked about direct quotation and paraphrase and using ideas, and I think it's helpful to think about kind of a bigger range of how are we including those voices in our text. So here's a list. It's not, they're not kind of perfect categories that never kind of have some overlap, but they might be a really good way to help you think about this. Sometimes you want to reference a source and you just want the gist of the idea, right? So you're including the general idea, the really big claim, main point, you're including it in your own words. without maybe the specifics of how that argument, how the source got to that point, without talking about all the methods, without talking about all their results, you're just talking about a handful of conclusions, etc. So just means the main point, the essence, the big idea. So sometimes that's all you're doing, is you want to include the big picture in your source, and that's one way that, or in your work, and that's one way you're using the source. Sometimes even kind of less than that, you're really just mentioning another source, right? So you want to say, like, these ideas are out there for whatever reason, and we'll look at some examples, right? So you're really just really broadly referencing that source, again, including that general idea in your own words. And then even more broadly, sometimes we're just providing the citation, right? Just putting it in parentheses so that you're indicating to your readers, there's stuff out there. Like, I've done this work. I know the sources that are saying this. So those are kind of the general big picture. You're referencing some big idea. When you really want to be focusing on a more specific idea in a source, you're probably going to paraphrase, which means expressing a specific idea, a couple of sentences, a paragraph from your source or from your reference in your own words. And then sometimes, and again, this really depends on the discipline, sometimes you want to use a direct quotation, like whatever that source is saying is so important, either stylistically, like the way it's phrased is so perfect, or it's for some reason very pivotally important in your prose, then you want to just use a direct quotation. So those are some things, and well, I'll go over some examples of each of these. So here's, we looked at this reference a few slides ago. What are these references, right? We just have, in one sentence, we have 4 citations, and they're the sentence, right? Multiple mothering ideologies have been identified in the literature, right? This big idea, and I'm giving the author here is giving a big overview. And I would say, whoops, I'm missing a slide. Oh dear. I seem to be missing a slide. These are just, I don't know what happened to the slide, right? We're just getting a general reference here, right? A gist, or even, right? These are all just a gist, each one of these. Here's another part of that same article. Stone and J. Williams each provided a nuanced analysis of how dominant cultural and structural forces in the workplace are in tension with those in the family, often favoring male workers and constraining women's choices. Now, these are interesting. I think there's 2 different things going on here. Actually, I've labeled the slide mention, but I would say these first 2 are mentions, right? We're very specifically saying, here's the source, Stone and Williams, and here's what they do. But then in the end of the sentence, we're also getting just this list of references, right? Referencing the bigger points in that whole sentence, right? So more general citation. Here are things talking about those sources. And we have a repetition of Stone and Williams, but other sources as well. Sometimes we only use citations, right? And that's certainly what we saw in this, pretty typical in things like engineering. This one happens to be a public health article, but here we can see, if we read like the first couple sentences, this article, healthy air, healthy brains. Children are exposed prenatally and in early childhood to multiple environmental stressors that can adversely affect their cognitive abilities, academic performance, and consequent educational trajectories, adult health, wealth, and status. And we see here a couple of citations, right? We see them numbered. And if we were to look at any of those, just have the first one, the first 2 is all I could get on the slide, right? This is really just a citation. Okay, in that first sentence, we were referencing Evans and this work on the environment of poverty. And the number 2 is Landrigan, Raw, and Galvez, and their work on environmental justice, right? So it's really very generally saying, here's work that also is looking at this same question. But let's talk a little bit about paraphrase, right? Because that's often the harder thing to do. So here's a sentence from a paper, Transitions, Combat Veterans as College Students, New Directions for Student Services. And here's the sentence. So imagine you're writing a paper about students as veterans, and you like this sentence. The focus of our study was the transition that combat veterans make when they become college students. For many with whom we spoke, this was the most difficult transition of all. So that you decide that's a really important idea. You're doing a study about combat veterans too, and you really think, okay, I'm grounding a lot of what I'm doing in the same ideas. This is an important idea. So how do you paraphrase it? Well, here is what that looks like from a Maryland professor, Dean Griffin and others, right? Better transitions for troops and application, et cetera, et cetera. And so here's how they have done that. Ackerman, DeRamio, and Garza Mitchell found that student veterans listed starting college as the most difficult transition out of the military they experienced. And I'm going to stop there. And if I pull up that previous version again, we can clearly see that, right? The focus of our study was the transition that combat veterans make. But here, the way it's being represented is pretty different, right? We see the same words, veterans, transition, college. Obviously, there's some key terms that we don't need to change, but we can see how that is these, it's not even a whole sentence, represents these two sentences clearly there's a citation, but in the author's own words, right, in Griffin and Gilbert's own words. And then we see another reference in this same sentence, right? So here the yet, et cetera, and here's the source for that, right? Only 22% of institutions with programs and services for military personnel have developed an expedited re-enrollment process to help students restart their academic efforts. Most require students who are returning, et cetera, right? And so again, they didn't feel the need to represent all of this information. They focused on the only 22%, but even there, only 22% of institutions with programs and services for military personnel, and only 22% of schools provide veteran-specific transition support. So again, some things you're not going to change. Obviously, the number needs to be represented correctly. They've said schools instead of institutions, et cetera, right? So that's a way of they've done more than just kind of change a few words. They've really made sure they understood what the original source was saying and put it in their own words to represent the meaning in their work. If there's questions about any of that, we can come back to those. All right, sometimes you're using direct quotation. So this happens often in the humanities, again, where we really want to get things right. So here's work from the chair of, Psyche Williams Forsman is the chair of American Studies. I think she's still the chair, maybe not. No, maybe she's not the chair anymore. Anyway, she's a professor in American Studies, and here's one of her books. And we could see here that she used a direct quotation, right? As Winston put it, my mother paid for this place with chicken legs. First, we lived in a log cabin that burned almost 50 years ago, and we rebuilt it from the road. Now, why use a direct quotation? Because she wants to, there's a value here in precisely representing the original source. This one in particular is an interview from a newspaper that she'd looked at in archives, and was very important for this scholar in this situation to represent the words of the original source very specifically. We can see these numbers, 61, 62, other things that are different kinds of references, right? But there's a direct, that's why you would use a direct quote, because you really want to precisely represent the original source. And here's another example. This one also from Women's Studies. It's hard to see the small type, but here I've pulled out the quotation. On the one hand, scholars in the Caribbean, Britain, and the United States speak of the importance given to the dominant beauty paradigm, which privileges, quote, white/light skin, straight hair, and what are seen to be European facial features. So again, and here's the reference that Cheryl Thompson is using this reference, Shirley Tate, and she wants there's a good reason why she wants to use those exact words. She's not quoting their whole sentence, right? She's incorporating this idea that's in quotation marks into her sentence, but being very clear, direct quotations to mark that the words come directly from the source. So let's think about what is acceptable use. A good summary with a citation, that can be a gist, a mention, etc. A good paraphrase with a citation, or a direct quotation with a citation. So obviously the with a citation is the thing that's in common there. And we'll try one more thing. I'm gonna look at some examples of what this might actually look like when you write it. So we've been looking at examples from published authors on campus, but let's look at a possibility. So this is an article about barbecue from the Harvard Business Review. So not exactly an academic journal, but imagine you had read this and wanted to reference it. So here is here's the paragraph we're going to work from. He was talking about barbecue and about economics and raising prices. Here's the paragraph. There are two key issues to consider before boosting prices during a period of strong demand. First, how confident are you that the good times will last? Second, what initiatives should be taken today so if need be, price can be gracefully rolled back? For many businesses, it may make sense to forego a few extra dollars of momentary profit and instead follow what Aaron Franklin practices in both setting prices as well as smoking meat: go low and slow. So I should have given you a little bit more context here. This article uses this barbecue place, Franklin's Barbecue in Austin, Texas, and talks about how he does not price his award-winning barbecue is not the most expensive barbecue in town. And so they interviewed him. Why does he price things the way he does? And he explains that he doesn't, that he wants to make sure customers come back, that he knows that if once he increases things, it's hard to decrease things again. And so this is the conclusion, and the author of the Harvard Business Review is saying, okay, here's in summary, like here are two key issues. How confident are you good times are going to last, that you can keep your prices high? And then what are you going to do if you need to roll back prices? And he makes this reference at the end. Do like this barbecue guy does. He does the same thing in cooking that he does in his prices. Make your decisions like you make your smoked barbecue, low and slow. Cook it low and slow. So that's the kind of catchy end note. And I'm concentrating on that for a reason, not because you're all going to go do some barbecuing tonight. All right, so looking at this paragraph, let's think about ways that we could reference it. We could use it in a paper that you were maybe writing about prices. And here's some possibilities. I've put the original there on the left under Harvard Business Review, and then here's a possible student version of it. A 2015 article in the Harvard Business Review suggests that two considerations, namely confidence in pricing and how a price increase can be retracted later, are key to any decision to raise prices in a time of high demand. And then Muhammad 2015, and Muhammad was the name of the author of this article. So the question is this a good citation? Is this good citation practice or not? And you can pause and think about it. And I won't give you a quiz. I'll reveal the answer, but I'll give people a second. Yeah, I would say the answer is yes. It is not plagiarized. It's a big green light there. The specific words and terms are not used directly from the source, and the source is very clearly acknowledged, right? We're seeing it, just go back and show that, right? We're both seeing in the way it's introduced, a 2015 article in the Harvard Business Review. So we're being told this came from someplace, and then we're being reminded with the citation at the end. And then if we look at the language, right, it suggests there are two considerations, two key issues to consider. That's good. Namely, and then he names them, summarizes them first, second here, namely this, and these are the keys, right? So good paraphrase, good citation, definitely not plagiarized. Let's look at another one, same paragraph. Rafi Muhammad, it's the author's name, 2015, a pricing strategy consultant, argues that, quote, for many businesses, it makes sense to forego a few extra dollars of momentary profit, end quote, in favor of establishing and maintaining customer relations. Good citation or not? This one should be pretty easy. This is a good one too. It's not plagiarized because it acknowledges the source. We see that very clearly. It's telling us in the opening line, and it uses a direct quotation, right? To actually use the article's words, we know exactly where those words came from, right? So if we look back, like what's in quotation marks came directly from the passage. It's the rest of the paragraph is in the author of this own words. but there's a clear separation. We know where it came from. We know all of the idea is based on the article, and we know that the specific words that are in quotations are taken directly from the article. So it's not plagiarized. It's a good use of quotation and a good citation. Here's another one. Oops, I forgot to have that one roll out. This one's tough though. Businesses should make pricing decisions thoughtfully. So this one's a little tricky. And I have it in yellow for a reason, right? Is this one plagiarized or not? It kind of depends, right? Businesses should make pricing decisions thoughtfully. So I'm not a business person. I don't have a background in economics or anything, but that's kind of obvious to me, right? So should it be cited, etc.? It depends a little bit. And I would say it depends on this. Did you already know this information? If you didn't, and you never thought about it until you read this article, then you absolutely should, and this is absolutely plagiarized. You need to reference the source with a citation at the end. Maybe it's still a gist, it's a general idea, that's fine. Another thing to think about, however, is you might still want to cite it, even if you thought about this before, you might still want to provide that just kind of citation at the end to indicate you've thought of this, but so have others, right? It's not just your thinking, it's confirmed by other sources. So you could leave it like this. This could be a fine sentence, not necessarily plagiarized, but there are a couple of reasons why you might want to cite it, either because you want that authority of referencing where it came from, or because you did in fact learn that from this article. All right, here's another one. Like a good chef preparing tasty barbecue, a business should go low and slow when making decisions about setting prices. Is this plagiarized or not? I would say this one is in fact plagiarized, right? There's no source acknowledged, and some of the words are taken directly from the source, right? That low and slow really is the key idea in the Harvard Business Review, and it's referenced here. If I were your instructor reading this paragraph, right? Like a good chef preparing tasty barbecue, a business should go low and slow when making decisions about setting prices. I would think, oh, that's so clever. That's a really good idea that you came up with, but it's not yours. So you've misrepresented it, right? There's no citation. And you probably should be quoting low and slow, right? So it is plagiarized, it's too close to the original, and it lacks a citation. Here's another one. Most businesses should consider two questions when deciding prices. First, how confident are they that the good times will last? And second, what initiatives should be taken now? So if need be, price can be gracefully rolled back. And this one has a citation, Muhammad 2015. Is it plagiarized? This is a tricky one too. This one is still plagiarized, right? Even though there's a citation, the language is too close to the original. I'm left to assume that these are your words. As an instructor, I'd be left to assume, okay, you got the idea from Muhammad 2015, but the words here are so close to the original that that's not a fair representation, right? You've really just kind of changed around a couple of words, changed around the structure a little bit, and it's really not a fair, it's really their words, Muhammad's words, not yours. If you put it in quotes, yep, if you quoted it directly, it's like we saw in the previous question, yep, thanks for that, right? So like this one, right? If you put it in quotes and have a citation, then it's fair game. But because this one is not, and the language is too close, it's still not, it's still really plagiarized. A plagiarism catcher would catch that, is one way to say that your language is too close. So, right, it's more than a few words are directly from the source, even though it's cited. And I want to stress that one, because you could throw in the citations and still not really be citing things correctly, still not be using your sources fairly and correctly. So just a quick recap, and I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions if there are any. When do you cite? You cite every time you refer to the ideas or the words of others. Direct quotations, information or figures, data, statistics you discovered in a source, ideas, theories, methodologies you're using. And again, that's in part, that's because you're leaving a kind of trail of development, right? Here's where my ideas come from. This is what we do in academia. Make it clear that we're joining someone else's conversation, right? It's not that you've stolen ideas. You're allowed, you're expected to build on other people's ideas and to do that fairly. So, and remember, there needs to be both an in-text citation, so in the prose, and a reference list at the end. If you make an in-text citation, anytime you have an in-text citation, you absolutely have to have a citation at the end. And if you have a citation in your references, it should probably be clear where in your text you've referenced that source. So sometimes, very rarely these days, used to be more common in the last millennium when I was in graduate school, sometimes you're asked for a works consulted, like here are all the things that I looked at and informed my thinking. But in your text, you would only cite things that you really directly referenced. That's atypical. You might still be asked for a works consulted. Certainly, like when you get to your dissertation, you'll probably have more things on your reference list than you're directly citing. There will be some big things that informed you, but for the most part, if you have something on your reference list, it should be pretty clear where it came from, where in your text it's showing up. And that is the end. So I have time, lots of time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing. And I can go back to any slides if anybody has questions about anything particular. But any questions?
Linda, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell us a little bit more about the Writing Center and what kind of support you provide and how to arrange for meetings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. So the Writing Center, which is physically in McKeldin, but like everything else these days, has a significant online presence. The basic function of the Writing Center is to provide one-on-one support for students at any stage of their writing or creating an oral presentation. So from ideas to organizing your ideas to revising a draft, to really polishing a draft, or the parallel for an oral communication, right? You have a conference presentation or a class presentation that you're doing. How do you plan it? How do you prepare it? Etc. One-on-one consultations with advanced graduate students. The graduate students that do the consultations are from a huge range of disciplines. So probably there's someone, if not in your discipline, there's probably at least somebody in your college who has a good understanding of the kind of work that you do. And they're really trained to be good listeners, be good readers, be able to ask questions and help you develop the work the way that you need it developed. And if you have questions around very rarely do students come in with like just simple, like, am I citing this correctly? Much more often the questions will be like, how do I understand how to cite this? Kind of those bigger picture questions. But I will also add that on Mondays and Wednesdays from 12 to 3, we offer drop-in hours, which are a great time to ask just those quick, like, is this citation correct kind of questions. And we do those Monday, they're hybrid, so you can find us online or in the Writing Center, and Wednesday they're just hybrid. And I think Simone already put the link to the Writing Center in that chat, and you can find the information right on our website about how to join those Zoom links. Janice, did you have a question?
I did have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, great. So for instance, so if I'm in education and I've had experiences with education type stuff, and I say something like, there are 3 types of schools, these are the 3 types of schools, but I did read an article from Joan, let's say, and she talks about the 3 types of schools. Can I like say these are the 3 types of schools, similarly to Dr. Joan, the year, and then explain what she says? Is that kind of?
That's it's funny. I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question. So yes, like saying that kind of broad idea and then referencing the idea. And I think that's an interesting, right? Every discipline has shared common knowledge, right? And so if it's so that there's what are the 3 schools? Is it private, public, charter, right? Kind of, is it like
Right. I was just, yeah, throwing
pretty
something out
generic,
there,
right? I mean, kind of pretty generically, then certainly an idea that's going to be pretty common across your discipline is fine to not cite, right? Like,
Mhm.
I don't have to tell people in literary studies that Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays on a lot of poems, right? Like, I don't need to
Right.
cite that. And those are both like really big examples of common knowledge, but there's certainly common knowledge that you don't have to cite. But then you often do still want to say something about where am I specifically building on? So like your example of, I'm really
Right.
looking at what does Jones say about what's important about these three kinds of schools. Then you do
Mhm.
want to put that in because that's an indication to your reader. Here's who I'm building on. I'm building on what Jones is talking about.
What did you think I was gonna ask?
I thought you were just going to ask, do I need to say, obviously all knowledge comes from somewhere.
Oh, right.
Do I
Okay,
really
yeah.
have to say like, there's public schools and charter schools and
Okay,
parochial
okay.
schools. Yeah, I thought that's usually students ask like, students start to get really nervous about really broad, general, like
Yeah.
common disciplinary knowledge. And obviously not every single word, we all get kind of anxious, like, have I ever had an original idea? Everything
Because
comes from somewhere, right?
Because I can also say in my experience, these are the right, and then
Yeah.
say the author. Okay.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
exactly. Yeah. Perfect question. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Pretty quiet.
I'll put my email in the chat one more time.
Oh, thank you.
And if people do have questions, I'm happy to
Great.
answer them.
Dr. McCree, another wonderful presentation that leaves me having to get barbecue for dinner tonight.
I know, if only we could run to Austin and get some good low and slow Franklin's. But I hear there's some good places in Hyattsville. So Riverdale. Yeah.
Riverdale. Okay,
Yeah.
good to know.
Yeah.
Gosh, what a great crash course on citations. And I appreciate all the examples. Just such a easy to understand presentation. You make it sound easy, but I know it's not, which is why I highly recommend that everybody follow up with the Graduate School Writing Center and use the resources at the library. We will send out links to all of those resources after the workshop. So thank you again, Dr. McCree. Thank you, Simone, for your 2 cents. Because there's a lot of support here for grad students at the university. And so don't forget that we're here. So thank you to everybody who joined us on Zoom and on YouTube. It was good for us to spend some time together. Please complete the post-workshop survey. Next week's workshop is how do I obtain permanent resident status in the US? The presenter of that workshop will be our very own immigration attorney, Patricia Minicon. And if you want a reminder about that workshop or all of our workshops, we suggest that you sign up for our weekly newsletter. So with that, everyone, have a great week. And as always, let us know how legal aid can help you.